Hi there, this is Michael Becker, and welcome to this session as we dig into the personal data and identity marketplace. With me today is Surash Patel, the VP of EMEA at TeleSign, and we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about personal data and identity. So Surash, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Nice to be here.
Okay, now I want to ask you a few questions, but let's start with who are you, what are you doing, and then we'll just have a conversation about what's going on here.
Sure, fantastic. So I'm currently the VP of EMEA here at TeleSign, having spent more years than I care to mention in mobile marketing and messaging, and most recently in TeleSign looking after digital identity. It's a nice new area actually for me in that after spending many years doing mobile marketing, which involved mobile web and mobile messaging, I've kind of dropped into this area with mobile identity and digital identity. I think, hang on a second, I completely missed a trick on my career and where it was going. In that I thought about the value exchange between the consumer and the brand from a marketing perspective, never really considered it from the digital identity perspective before. And seeing the numbers on digital fraud right now, I think that case is becoming more and more clear to me.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So I don't think you're alone. I think a lot of us miss that, right?
Yeah.
So where's the miss? I mean, what did we not understand?
So I think the recent numbers that I saw in I think is a Javelin report, 53 billion is the loss expected on digital fraud, and when you dig into that, about a third of it is what we consider the usual digital identity fraud, like cyber attacks to a brand, where the consumer actually doesn't know. But the other two-thirds, which is a huge number and growing, by the way, is actually where the consumer probably had that, oh, is that what that was moment? Because this is where the consumer's identity has been taken over, and they've been socially engineered without realizing it. And then that's led to either account takeovers, digital fraud, cards or products and services being taken in their name, which they weren't aware of.
Got it. All right. And so tell me more, like what is, and I have other questions for you in just a few minutes. I want to get your background, like what brought you to wanting to have this conversation?
Yeah. So like I said to you before, I kind of missed that element of it. And as I spent a lot of time talking to marketing directors and trying to get access to that marketing fund in order to build campaigns around messaging and SMS and this whole SMS exchange around chat bots and things like that. So I was thinking about that side of things, and then you kind of saw that you get the customer to the point of buying. And then what would happen is there'd be a whole bunch of additional security thrown at the consumer. Now, from a marketer's perspective, you're like, oh my God, what we do? We spent all this money to get to the customer to buy. And then just at the point when you want them to buy, we do all these security checks on them. And at worst, it just puts so much friction in place that customers just go elsewhere. So it's like, oh, okay, this is something where the fraud team and the marketing team have actually come at loggerheads, and I don't think that was really thought of. I think that kind of went under the radar, and I think there's an awakening now of this.
Got it. So you're in this context, the mechanic you're discussing then, from a marketing perspective, is really kind of that know your customer issue, right? So at that point of transaction, when we're about to exchange money, right, and establish a real relationship, if you will. You as a business need to know who I am, right? Correct. And then we can go from there. And if you don't, then that leads to fraud and all of these other things. So I kind of get your position. So real quick before we move to my questions, can you please kind of introduce your company? What is it? What are you doing? What problem are you solving? And
so TeleSign over the years was traditionally known as a C+ company, doing lots of work around one-time passwords. Worked with 24 out of the 21 out of 24 of the big global internet companies as we know of them, everyone from Alibaba to Amazon, if you will. And through that insight, through that experience, you kind of started to build up a sense of, oh, actually, I know how a good phone number behaves. They'll typically get this number of two-factor authentications, notifications on a weekly basis, typically be at the same IP address in the same country with the same operator. Now, when brands come to onboarding and they want to check a phone number, they can come to us and they can say, have you seen this number before? Do you have any insights as to how this number possibly has reacted in the past? And we can tell, and we'll do a risk rating 1 to 1,000, and we can give you a sense of, whether we've got a lot of information on this number and whether this is pretty normal stuff, or whether we think that there's likely to be something a little bit suspicious about this phone number. So lots of brands are using us for onboarding.
So the insight that's coming to me, or the analogy, is like the credit score for the phone number. It's
pretty much, pretty much.
Like, what's the is this a legit, if I make this loan, if I communicate with this number, is there a legit person on the other end?
Correct. That's why, we've seen a lot of traction with the buy now, pay later type companies, because they have to make a decision really quickly. Now, some of the transaction values might not be massive, but you do that over many, many thousands of transactions, it starts to hurt. And the idea is that you have,
if you'll lose a penny on large volume, that adds up to a lot of money, right? So
absolutely right. And if you think about it, we use machine learning to do it. So you look at the A2P behavior, the application to person behavior, which is a brand messaging to a consumer. And then because of our tie-up with Bix, what we're able to do is look at the P2P behavior as well. You bring these two things together into a machine learning model, and you have a really nice sense of what, and I won't say normal, but what does a usual consumer behave like? And that's obviously changing as well, right? We're all changing. We're all becoming slightly more digital natives and picking up the phone less and doing more messaging, aren't we? So, this is an evolving model.
Yeah, and again, I mean, we made some assumptions of consumer this or consumer that. At this point, though, all is it's a phone number.
Correct.
Right, and are you able to actually just from behavior predict the patterns of that phone number, or can you actually resolve to a human? Because phone numbers are often considered PII in some contexts. So how do we handle that?
Yeah, I mean, in this instance, we're mainly working on basis of phone numbers, and we provide other phone ID services, as we call them, where we actually take the operator data as well. So we're integrated with many operators around the world. Then we'll take their data, and then we can do a contact match. So then this instance, I get phone number. The brain goes to me. Oh, this is Surash Patel, and then we can check with the phone number to say, does that name match that phone number from your record? And it's having that authorized data to be able to check against. And in this instance, it's phone number data working with mobile operators.
Yeah, and another term I've been hearing as of late, and it was coined by a guy named Dave Hughesby out of the self-sovereign identity world, is authentic data. Yep. Essentially, what you're doing is you're creating an authentic, verifiable footprint against these.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Yeah.
And then once I have authentic data, I can move forward. Okay, so this is terribly exciting, and I'm really interested in it. So I want to back up though and get a bigger macro view for a few minutes, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So. My kind of first question is, what is the personal data and identity marketplace? And clearly it does appear that there is one, because you are actively participating in a market for the exchange and brokering of personal data for a variety of use cases and reasons. So when it comes to this personal data and identity marketplace, in your mind, like, what is it? How do you define it? And like, how do we measure it in terms of like economic size? And then the last kind of sub question I'll ask you is like, what direction is it going? And what I mean by that, is, are we going to continue to go down and I'm going to possibly interject my own bias in here, so I apologize. Are we going to continue to go down a more dystopian view of, where Orwell was in fact an optimist, right? Where we're totally surveilled in every aspect of our lives and society. Or do we go down a path of a utopia where people have complete agency of self, or is there some middle ground? And as I said in the preamble, for me, that middle ground is that identity nexus, where there actually is an equilibrium state in society where we're getting the best of both worlds and benefit to risk mitigation for all parties concerned. Long story short, and preamble that question, like, what is that? Where are we going?
So I think we're just we're at the stage of that where I think it's been identified. I think
What is it? What is it?
It as in the value that people are starting to put on their own data. People are becoming much more aware of their data. Laws like GDPR across Europe and the privacy laws introduced across the US now, they're making consumers increasingly aware of the value of their data. You have data, it should be respected, it should be looked after, it should be managed, and you should have control over that. I think it was one of the consultancies did a report in the US recently, and they found that 97% of people really valued that data, and they were untrusting of firms in terms of how they were going to use the data that's provided to them. So consumers are becoming more and more savvy about this data. Initially, from a perspective of just protecting themselves, I saw that 50% of consumers typically put in bad data, wrong data, incorrect data if they don't trust a brand. Typically, date of birth will be incorrect. And then it may well be, some of the information around their contact details. But, for date of birth to be incorrect, for brands trying to onboard you, that tells you two things. It tells you that people are very, very cautious about their data, because they know if someone's got my date of birth and my phone number and my address, then they can do something with it. The second thing it tells you is that people are untrustworthy of, the brands themselves. They haven't quite worked out, because the brand probably hasn't told them, this is why we want that information from you. This is why it's important. Now, if you look at this, there was a report by checkout.com recently, and they did a survey of 15,000 consumers and then 1,500 merchants. And they said to the consumers, okay, and this was UK, France, Germany, and US. And they said, how much do you value what's going on in that customer journey? And they quantified it to, it was on average $4 across the market. $4 is what people would pay to know that there's a higher degree of authentication happening during that process. Now, this is skewed to those markets and possibly skewed to a particular demographic too, where, the transactions might be bigger.
So let me stop you there, though. When you say people, like, who's the
consumers?
People?
You and I.
Consumers would pay $4
in respect of knowing that the data they're providing versus the transaction that they're about to enter into is safe.
Right. So essentially, we're putting a value on privacy.
So for a value on privacy.
So for a given transaction, on average in these markets, we're saying that people would pay $4 per transaction to understand their privacy.
Correct. Okay. And that was a real eye opener for me. It's a real paradox, because we've been hearing for years now, reduce the friction, reduce the friction, reduce the friction. People don't want to have friction. And then you're starting to realize, well, we need to look at this a lot more closely. This is where we get into this space of, we really need to start looking at that value exchange. How much am I asking for from the consumer, and what is the consumer getting in return for that? And, some brands like Deliveroo, I was talking to the other day, they're saying we do this gradual onboarding. So when it comes to the first transaction or the first interaction, I might just ask for your name and email address. As we start to deepen our relationship, then I start to ask for more and more information. And what's happening is, I'm building trust with you as a brand. You're building trust with me because I'm giving you more transactions. And therefore, I possibly feel safer about giving you more information. But I must tell you why I'm asking for that information. And that's where, right now, that's not being monetized as a consumer. Not in a direct way where they directly benefit, but at least people are starting to respect the fact that you might not want to give all of that information out in one go if I'm not giving you a just reason to have it.
Yeah, it's like, and again, it shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, if I were to walk up to you on the street and say, hey, great meeting you, let's get married. Right? Yeah, give me your social security number and let's have a co-bank account.
Exactly.
It's not going to happen. So why is that any different online?
This is the thing. I think so many brands have been pushed online, because of all of the recent things that have happened in the world, and they are learning. I mean, this was the consumer's perspective, the brand's perspective, the merchant's perspective. They were still thinking about how do we, reduce the friction, and still keep asking. So there's this mismatch. I think brands are starting to wake up to this now. There's a lot more granularity. You've got to think about the transaction. You've got to think about the country, the region that you're operating in. Some regions, the US is a huge domestic market. You take Europe or Asia, people travel around in between these countries all the time. If I'm a delivery service sending, food or parcels to these individuals, I might need to check them in each country that they go to. hey, do I do that? And does the consumer feel safe? And does it make sense to the consumer for me to do a higher rigor of testing just to validate that they are who they say they are when they might happen to have visited another country for, for the week or so?
Yeah.
So we've really got to start to understand this customer journey. So when you think about your dystopian future or the utopian future, I'd like to think that we're educating consumers more now about the value of their data. Governments, like the UK, are thinking more about this, and there's all kinds of initiatives going on right now where they're trying to create, identity services that make it easy for consumers to, work with government instead of having to, re-authenticate each time. So we're starting to get the value of it. It's going to be, I don't imagine, very long before a business comes up with a use case that you can monetize that for the consumer. And then really shift the balance back the other way. Because right now, I think brands have had it their own way. And as we go more and more online, you've got to respect that consumer, a lot more.
Yes. And what I'm hearing more and more too is it's like at the end of the day, I don't think we should lose sight that, this idea that, we do want to have friction go away. I mean, we don't necessarily like the friction, but we want to make sure that we're getting utility. It's like that benefit that, that we get back and forth. Okay.
Absolutely.
So there is this large thing we call the personal data and identity marketplace. And, there's massive numbers of companies that are what we'll call data brokers that are brokering and selling data and valuing it like X cents per email, Y cents per, date of birth, those kinds of, that's one way of measuring the personal data marketplace. Another way of measuring the personal data marketplace is on the value generated, share of wallet, right? We effectively use personal data, the value that is generated by and for a company and or for society at large is X, and so if you do that, the numbers I'm seeing is the personal data marketplace and identity marketplace worldwide is anywhere from some, low to mid hundreds of billions of dollars on the low end. If you measure it in terms of, the price of data or the cost of the MarTech services or the security tech services to manage the data, to multiples of trillions of dollars if you measure it on value.
Because it's in everything we do. It's in everything we do. And that's the reason why it's going to become so important. Right now with PSD2, we're opening up your bank account. So we're making the details in your bank account available to all these other fintech companies that can initiate payments or help you manage, your monthly allowance. And we're making it easy for you to manage your bills, manage your transactions. There's no reason why that wouldn't be linked to your identity in some way. Certain transactions related to certain levels of data and information they have about you, but with the consumer in charge of that, as opposed to the brand initiating those conversations. All right.
Let me ask you another question. Again, I have opinions on all of this, but I want to hear yours.
Yeah.
For me, I hear this, what's the difference between personal data and identity? What's the relationship between those things?
So from my perspective, personal data is going to be the attributes of your behavior, and it's going to be around your phone number, the characteristics about your phone number, the characteristics about your basket spend with a supermarket, those kinds of things. Your identity is linked to you and your passport, your driver's license, who you are, the essence of who you are, and be able to prove that. On the personal data side, that may or may not be you. It doesn't have to be you. I don't have to identify that person is Michael Becker. I just happen to know that person always buys peas on a Tuesday, right? So that's the characteristics of the individual. I think they don't necessarily need to be linked, because if I'm in charge of my data, why should a supermarket actually know, my date of birth, aside from just knowing I'm over 18 to buy alcohol, obviously, but why should they know other things about me when all they're really concerned about is my buying persona? Now, they would like to know other things about me to understand what more they can sell to me. Well, if that's going to be the case, that's going to cost you. And I want to be in charge of that.
But I do see these things being as interlinked, though, because even earlier in our discussion today, you talked about personal data being and the attributes of personal data being used as an identifier. And so in that regard, it's not a what the industry calls a deterministic identifier. Like I can't determine that is in fact you, but it's a probabilistic identifier, right? In the sense that with pretty high level probability, I got a sense that this this phone number, if you will, is not fraudulent. And then you're only one or two steps away from saying this phone number is not fraudulent and it's yours.
Belongs to. No, I agree with that.
Because you said your company does in fact both, right? On one side, you do the probabilistic identity. And on the other side, you actually do the deterministic.
You can do that if required. Absolutely right. And I think for me, it comes down to the risk of that the brand's willing to participate in. In the early days, like I say, this gradual onboarding, in the early days, the risk of a brand may just be small levels of transactions, the initial deliveries, the initial takeouts, but as that relationship deepens, then am I as a brand incurring more risk? Therefore, do I want to know more about you? So you may well have the polarization between small value transactions, high value, longer life cycle transactions. And do I really need to be identified as Surash Patel with this date of birth and this address? If I'm going to spend £5 or €5, $5, once every 6 months on chewing gum, right? No, I don't.
Got it. So let's flip the coin a little bit. So when we've been talking a lot about the brand, the importance of this identity resolution for the purpose of the brand, particularly for fraud mitigation, which was the conversation we started with. Which I think is great. But what about the importance of identity verification for the individual to be able to say, how do I know you are who you are? Right? If I'm sitting here on the end of a phone and I see a link on that phone, or if I'm sitting in a browser and I see a link in a browser, what certainty do I have that you are the brand that you say you are, other than the fact that there's a little lock, which is really all that's saying is that the connection's secure. That's not actually giving me validation or certificate that that brand is actually in fact who they say they are. So like when do individuals get to flip the script and actually hold businesses more accountable for verifying themselves?
No, that's a really good point. I think I came across an article which I posted on LinkedIn recently. Consumers definitely need to be much more aware. I mean, we've had email scams for so many years where people's email account gets taken over, and then we start getting emails from supposedly friends, but it's because their account's been taken over. The same thing's happening with brands. We've had the big phishing delivery SMS phishing attacks in the UK recently, and in other countries. I saw that in the US as well. So brands definitely need to be thinking a lot more about that. Some of the initiatives from MEF, working with the financial services sector in the UK, has started to make sure that the IDs in the SMS are definitely coming from the banks, and trying to squeeze out that margin of error that's duping consumers. But we all know fraudsters are getting more and more sophisticated. So I think some of the age-old advice about, if someone sends you an email, asks you to click on a link, you need to reach out to the brand through maybe another channel and just confirm it's them. You need to make that positive link, by calling the brand themselves through a published number, and then confirm it is actually them when it comes to some element of security or validation they're looking for. But how do we do this on a transactional basis? I think that's going to be the key, because we talked about risk from the brand's perspective. Now we're talking about risk from consumers' perspective. We've all seen the posts on some of these marketplaces, property marketplaces, where people are pretending to have a property when they don't, and they're taking the conversations offline and saying, "I'll offer you a 20% discount if we don't do this through the site." So we've seen all of that kind of stuff happening. So those kinds of social network brands, we're working with a lot of those to stop fraudulent accounts being set up on those. But that's a huge issue still. But coming back to your point on the consumer, I think consumers are going to become increasingly discerning. And that's where, ironically, we kind of come back to that same point, is then how much am I willing to pay for that extra layer of scrutiny, just to make sure that the brand is who they say they are.
Well, and to what extent am I capable of like that investment, right? So, for instance, in some respects, we're asking households to become their own CIOs, And there is a certain or CTOs, right? And there is a certain bit of personal accountability that we all need to be taking for ourselves, for sure. But the fact of the matter is, if I'm single mom working 2 jobs, it's but yet I'm being forced to participate in this digital economy. I mean, of course I've got the privacy paradox. Of course I'm just going to say, forget it. I don't have time. I'm just trying to feed my kids. So how do we make this balance?
I think that's where there's likely to be some kind of curation services for the consumer, where you're going to go to a trusted brand, verify once, and then expect them to help you manage those kinds of processes, those kinds of accounts, those kinds of transactions. Because, I mean, we see this right now with the aging population. For those of us who have parents and relatives and friends who are in their 80s or their 90s, some of these people don't want to embrace the technologies that we have today, and they're starting to feel very excluded from the world that we're living in. And as we know now that technology and business models are accelerating at a faster pace than ever before in human history. In 10 years' time, who knows what kind of conversations we're going to be having. But the one thing we know is that we're all going to be increasingly vulnerable as more of our services, more of our citizen identity moves online. So partly the government's got to play an increasing role in this and facilitate mechanisms where we can have that kind of, I think, consumer partner, consumer, help. There's a little bit of that now, happening again with PSD2 and the open banking initiatives where brands, are saying, yes, let me help take over your balance, and then I'll manage the payments and make sure the transactions are going in the most effective manner for you. So there is, and there's companies that will manage your household bills in a similar fashion. So I think we're starting to see the emergence of those kinds of services.
Again, one of the biggest challenges, though, is as a lot of those services are startups, and they're they may not necessarily they have the funds to create the front end WYSIWYG things to make it exciting, but will they really have the security chops to make sure the back end security and the infrastructure and the interoperability is all right there? And I think those are one of the really hard dances that we're going to have to play through as this market evolves.
For sure. And I'll put the question back to you. You sit in the heart of Silicon Valley. The companies that are your neighbors have got more information on us than we kind of hope they did, but they do. And you wonder, well, what part are these tech giants going to play in this evolving ecosystem, and how is that going to be done in a fair and equitable way, without just consumers handing over all of their privacy just because they've had an update to terms and conditions and not even realize they've done it.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves. I remember there was a gaming company in the UK back around 2013, 2014, that actually, for a 24-hour period, it changed their terms and conditions that said, if you buy from us in the next within the next 24 hours, unless you check this box, we own your immortal soul. Right. And if you do check the box, we'll give you a $50 coupon. Right. And it was just mostly a game.
The price of my immortal soul.
Yeah. But what's the price of your immortal soul? And the reality is, and I think that one of the biggest issues we have is, for example, the marketing industry, often refer to this idea of informed consent, or you read the privacy policy, you agreed to the terms. The fact of the matter is, and we measure everything, and we know that people are not reading the privacy policies. Right. We know they're not reading the terms. There's no way you could read a 1,000-word legal document in 3 seconds.
As a layperson.
Or as a layperson, right? And the reality is, I saw a stat the other day that said, in America, the average reading level is an 8th grade reading level for an adult, and the average privacy policy is written for the 12th grade reading level. So we're not equipped. No. From just a simple literacy perspective to have informed consent, let alone to do so in nanoseconds as we're clicking through in our services. So, I think there's a massive infrastructural approach. The other thing I think we need to think about too is for certain, I don't want to call them classes of people. I need the right rhetoric or language for this, but for certain groups of people, there's no problem being surveilled. We love it. My Ring cameras, my devices, because I think for that economically advantaged individual, they can pay for their privacy. They can pay that extra $4 per transaction.
That's right. That's right.
But there's a wide group of people that's not the case.
Yeah.
And the surveillance is actually overly intrusive, overly biasing, and and if we're not careful, they can end up back in jail, or they can end up being increased victims of fraud, or be exposed to any number of the different isms of bias that affect society. How do we close those gaps? I mean, is that government? Is that people? Is that private institutions? What do we do?
I think there's no easy answer to that one. I think at one level for sure, there has to be some analysis by government just to try and create some kind of a level playing field. But then we also know where there's a business opportunity and there's money to be made, commerce will find the gap, and they will try and find a gap. But it's got to be done in a way that is much more sensitive to the economics of the individuals than it has ever been done so before. Otherwise, you do and will no doubt get that polarization of society between the haves and the have-nots, and the have-not, unfortunately, forced into a position where they're having to give away their privacy and their data just on the basis of getting the services that the more affluent would be quite happy to pay for, and wouldn't necessarily need to give up their privacy to do so.
Right.
So it's a very, very tough problem.
And one of the things I've been hearing more lately as well is one of the challenges is as well as our regulators don't really even understand the technology or the services that they're regulating. Right. So how do how are you to put rules of the road, if you will, down when you don't even understand how to what a car is, or like it's kind of what we said before. The market and the technology and what is possible is moving way faster than people can keep up with, and we've slowly been getting into this. If you think about cyber fraud, go back 10-15 years, there probably wasn't even a cyber fraud department in many police forces, and now they do have them, and they're getting more and more sophisticated. But I think there's two people that read privacy, isn't there? The fraudsters and lawyers. No one else reads privacy statements, right? And so when it comes to actually understanding these things, there's two ways to think about it. Either we have to find some ways of distilling the language to make it much more simple and teach these kind of things to children at schools, the same way that we've been teaching them how to read and write. Maybe we need to teach them more cyber skills and to learn about some of these things so they can actually have an opinion on society and on these things, and they will be shaping the future, right? This is you and I with our background and our completely different experiences talking about a topic that's going to affect all of the generations that come after us. So I think there needs to be much more education at a younger level about some of the implications of these things so we can have a much more educated consumer. Fantastic. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the personal data and identity marketplace. And again, I could go on with you for this for days, hours.
Fantastic.
It's just, I love it. But I want to ask you two more questions. So we've got a general sense of this identity marketplace. That's good. The second question is, what do people need to know? And when I say people, or what do we need to know? What I mean by is the person, the connected individual, the public institution and their leaders, and the private institution and their leaders. If I were to ask you, like in the context of what we've just been talking about, what are the two or three things that absolutely each one of them need to know? And are those things the same or slightly different?
I think they're slightly different. For individuals, for consumers, they absolutely need to know the value of their data. They absolutely need to know how they can challenge the brands, and because it's through consumer opinion and consumer behavior that the brands will be challenged about the kinds of information that they're asking for that they might not possibly need. So educating the consumer and saying, do you really need this information, Brian? Is it really that important to you? Is there something else that would act that could act in a way that could give you the comfort? So that's something that consumers, I think they should be more challenging of a brand. And that's tough because we're talking about individual consumers versus, very, very large brands. The brands themselves, they know some of this stuff, but they need to understand that there's increasingly a higher level of attacks, like we saw right from the start of this conversation, coming from social engineering attacks. They're cyborg attacks where there's a combination of, digital technology, firing out messages combined with individuals, sending out phishing emails or making phone calls. That combination is putting lots of pressure on consumers, and that's resulting in lots of fraudulent accounts being set up and lots of accounts being taken over. So I think brands need to be aware of that and do more in life. You've onboarded these customers and they might have been safe when they onboarded, but do you know if they've moved? Do you know if they've changed their phone number? Do you know if something else has changed about them? So they need to be continually checking and, doing that, continual evaluation and authentication, verification, and find, nicer ways of doing it where there's an even value exchange. And then, as we talked about for the public institutions need to understand what their place in this is, and that's acting as regulator for the brands that come up with the value propositions, but also acting as advocates for the consumers themselves. Because I think that's where enough hasn't been done. There hasn't been enough to protect the consumers to say, okay, brands, you only really need to ask for this kind of information if you need it for these purposes. And I think that's probably somewhere where we could even the balance out a bit more.
Okay, and then you've already touched on this a little bit, but just to summarize, what do you think each of these three constituents need to do? Like, what do I do next? Like, what's the first? What do I need to prioritize?
Yeah. So as an individual, it's behavior. It's behavior. It's the don't click on the links if something important seems to be happening. Don't call the brand. Initiate the contact. Do it yourself. That's probably the most important advice you can give to individuals. To the brands themselves, like I said before, continually check, because you don't know how people's circumstances change, their lifestyles change. So you need to keep going back and check and give the customers are paying you money, give them the respect that they need to say, well, is everything okay? Are things still moving the same way it has? Have your circumstances changed? Has some other detail about you changed? And then, for the government institutions, the bodies, it's just get more involved, right? Create forums, create initiatives, get more involved in this stuff, so that there's more collaboration between brands and government about the needs of the consumer and the needs of the citizen.
But so where does the money come from all of this?
Oh gosh, how
do we fund this?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. One is the amount of money, that's lost in bad transactions, unpaid transactions, account takeovers, that's huge. So just reducing that even by a half, that would make a big a big dent in that fraud, but will create the incentives hopefully for people to do more proactive work. Instead of picking up the pieces of the fraud, let's try and prevent more of the fraud in the first place. And then you should see a healthy change in the balance. I mean, retail fraud in shops, I think, what do they say? They say it's they call it shrinkage, right? They say 5 or 6% shrinkage of your revenue in a face-to-face store. It'd be interesting to see what the figures of that are for online stores, and then think that's the return on investment you have for doing more work proactively.
Right. It's kind of like a preventative health, right?
It's insurance,
you
right?
exercise every day over time, you'll be healthier. So, there's a preventative health mechanism. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to be able to have more of a dialogue with you in the future.
Yeah, me too, Michael. Really great to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.